Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today we're going over part 2 of the Dark Fina character analysis. We're going through her ability. So specifically, we're doing the class and job analysis with some extra insight as to the toggles of the abilities, how potent they are, how she uses them AI prioritization-wise, which is the second part, and showing how the buff order actually works. Then we're going over a quick TMR review, talking about some of its potential and possibilities, and then my general thoughts to kind of encapsulate what we've had in part 1 and part 2. And for those of you who are just coming now, part 1 was the character overview, the base stat and total stat analysis, her damage potential, and the report card. And part 3, which is definitely going to be the most nitty-gritty and complex of these, is going to do an overview on some of the cast time math, because it is part of her kit, some Esper synergies, weapon optimization, vision card analysis, and then some trust zone recommendations. All things that really make the difference between just an average Dark Fina and one that really could be meta defining. One of the most exciting things about her as a character is that she now completes the Dark meta as we know it, or at least as we knew it in JP. There's a lot of things here that Dark Fina does to complete the cast of Dark, Leela, and Joker. Obviously, Lemire is still in play as a very, very good support unit for them. And depending upon your rank, you're obviously still getting some good value out of characters like Black Rosalena and Garvel, amongst probably some others. Now, I don't think the Dark meta will be as oppressive in Global as it is in JP, just because we do have some characters and vision cards that do affect the balance of things overall, but she is a very important cog for a variety of reasons, and I'm going to kind of intertwine some of that in here, because if you look at her just in a silo, while she's an excellent unit, you may not see the true value unless you really also see the synergy that she brings to the team comp, which is a big part of the character value, practically speaking. So the class and job overview, so the passive abilities, I actually genuinely really like them. The demonic secrets here is a must-have in my opinion for almost everything, where spear penetration of 40, spirit of a 24, both of those together are good enough by themselves, but also the agility of 12%. Now, as we saw in the original part 1 character review, she's a little bit on the slower side, so that agility of 12% really does help bump her up, at least to stay competitive in the turn order, not only with her teammates, but also with the enemy, where we are now seeing very, very fast characters. She does kind of fall behind, if only by a couple points, but don't focus on that too much. It's really not anything too impactful. But the other ones here I genuinely like because they are useful for a variety of different chess matchups, where Scholarly Intuition is my second favorite one here, with the defense of 12, the accuracy of 20. Both of those really do great things. Devout Intuition, don't sleep on. Although it is a decreased magic of 20, she is strong enough offensively wise that I don't think that really nerfs anything too hard, but you do get the extra defense and spirit of 15 there. And the Knowledge Reserves actually does have a time and place as well, where you're decreasing the casting time by 200. So that's going to be covered a lot more in part 3 when we look at the different breakpoints and thresholds for what casting time tends to do. Now, from a counter perspective, she does have some good counters, but a little bit on, I won't say average, but nothing outstanding. So preemptive magic is a good one. Don't get me wrong. There is value there and a 30% chance to proc. It's got a larger range than reactive force, so there's never a time you would ever use reactive force. But preemptive magic at least has the upside that maybe you can kill an enemy before they do damage to you whatsoever. But I am a big fan of counter cure. That's one I've used primarily. Talking to people, that seems to be the general consensus, where particularly when you consider running the dark meta, that you don't have a dedicated healer all the time, and you have to kind of rely on some of your own self-healing and evasion. Counter Cure is definitely one of the better ones for her, where it does only have a 20% chance to activate, but it heals her for 120 times. And the Counter Cure potential, when you do some of the math here, if you assume that she has on average 1600 magic, that's before any kind of buffs or anything, that's just like a basic stat screen. Because she is a 97 faith unit healing herself, a 97 faith unit, 1600 magic will net you about 3700 health restored. Now, if you have a Trust Stone passive that gives you the 10 healing power up, it actually counts twice because she is the healer and the healee, so it's technically 10 healing power for both. Ends up being about 4400 healing, and if you end up having 20 healing power, and you can do that by both the Trust Stone passive and equipping either the defense or spirit set bonus on the left side, that'll effectively give you 20 healing power, you actually end up healing in the mid 5s there before any kind of buff. So Counter Cure is a really good one for replenishing essentially half of her health. Really good for her survivability. So don't love these, but considering how you're going to see her most often, Counter Cure actually is very useful. Now, from the main job, Sorceress of Hess, we're going to go through the buffs first of all. She's kind of unique in that she has, I would say, an above average amount of buffs here. She has 3. For a damage dealer, you don't always get that many, but Mystic Revoke is the first one here. It's an increased magic attack modifier of 25 for 3 turns. It also nullifies Confusion, Stun, and Berserk. Like this one, don't love it. This one for me is definitely more of a chess matchup where you're anticipating some of the status effects, where obviously that's the real utility here, that if you're going against, let's say, Mono Wind and they have a Sadali who has a giant AoE confuse ability, this certainly helps in nullifying that confusion potential. Otherwise, she does have some other buffs that I think you'd probably rather have. So End for Wall is her main buff, where it essentially increases her magic by 40% for herself and allies, increases the spirit of 20 for herself and allies, light resistance and dark resistance of 20% for herself and allies, and then spirit penetration of 20 for herself. That's an immensely powerful buff. It does have a height of 1, so you do not need to be on even plane with your teammates to get it off. But this obviously does a really wide variety of things in terms of survivability for mirror matchups or going against light, maybe bumping up the survivability against enemy magic units. Overall, End for Wall is a very good ability. You just got to get it right in the tuning of things, because she will cast it twice if you only get one teammate and then another one moves in, you have to go buff them as well. So got to be careful there. Now, Curse of the Serpent is a very impactful one, but it isn't always prioritized like End for Wall is. We'll get to that toward the end of the section where I go over the prioritization, but it is the one that gives her re-raise, and it also increases her AoE resistance to 40 for 3 turns as long as her health is above 70%. So that's an absolutely stellar amount of survivability there. It does have a cast time, but I don't really think it matters, because usually you use it fast enough that it's not the difference between living or dying, but certainly can be. If you are casting it and an enemy kills you and you have neither the AoE resistance or the re-raise, well, she's dead. So something to keep in mind, but I haven't noticed it being a big detriment yet. So these are the 3 buffs to really consider when you're talking about the main job. Now for the attacks, there's only 3 of them. Again, kind of different than the normal damage dealer. Comet is the first one. It's 185%. It's elementalist, which I'm going to refer to a couple times here. This is very important. So it does have a range height of 2, cast time of 320, which is right in line with the next ability, Dystopia, which is also a range height of 2, but the AoE height can reach up to 1 square above once you decide to pick the tile. It's a similar modifier, 185%, but it's a double hit, and it's also a 25% chance to inflict stop, while also being that cross-shaped AoE. So there's actually a time and place where she'll end up prioritizing these two, and I'll get to that on the next slide. But Sorcery Strike is really the bread and butter of how she opens her rotation, provided there's enemies in range. It obviously is the great value of Dispelling Runic Shield, which is Celeste's big buff that is kind of a game changer. It also decreases the unit resistance by 30 for 3 turns for that target. So this is single target, also a range height of 2. It is a 165% modifier, so 20 less than these other ones, and it has actually a 30% extra chance to hit, so really great for some evade units. Now, there's a couple things to consider here when you talk about like min-maxing how she ends up using some of these abilities, because it's not as straightforward as you might think. So the difficulty in maxing the damage, number one, everything depends on whether or not the enemy is 30 unit resistance imperiled or not. That will obviously be a massive damage difference between either using Comet or using Dystopia, where Comet gets the benefit of the 30 unit resistance down, Dystopia doesn't. Number two, how many dark modifiers you have, where there is a world, since they're both 185%, although the Dystopia is a double hit in AoE, so on average it should do more damage to a variety of enemies, there is a world where you actually still might use that on a single target, depending upon how many dark modifiers you have, because you have to recall, Comet is Elementalist. So when you have things like Diabolos, which has dark attack up, that will not apply to the Comet ability. So it's to your benefit that when you're equipping her, you really do stack up as much magic attack as possible instead of dark attack, because magic attack at least applies to both. And it'll allow the AI to make some smarter decisions based upon whether you use the AoE or the single target in order to maximize the damage. And that's the third point here, how many magic modifiers you have. And even then, I have seen some instances where Dystopia does get preferred over Sorcery Strike, because it does technically extend 1 square further because of the nature of the AoE. So there is an opportunity where she might not dispel the Runic Shield for Celeste if Celeste is just out of range. And so a lot of you might be looking at this and being like, all right, well, it looks like a lot of single target attacks, not as much AoE, really kind of limited in how she can attack the enemies, but that's actually not a bad thing. It's one of the reasons why she works so well alongside Dark Leela and Joker, that if you consider Leela and Dark Joker have 2 amazing giant AoE abilities, they're not hurting for AoE potential. And she certainly still has it technically via the Dystopia here, but now what she does with the unit resistance down is that it enables Joker and Leela to do damage in other ways via some other single target effects. So it's the kind of thing where if they were too one-dimensional and doing a bunch of AoE, we could probably stack a bunch of AoE resistance and survive just fine. But now that there's the threat of a very hard-hitting unit resistance down as well, and looking out for unit resistance, now it becomes a lot harder to gear for all of those kinds of things. Now, when we get into the sub job, The Sorcerer of Hess Subjob is actually an abysmally bad subjob. This is horrifically bad. Demon's Kiss, the opportunities to use this are very, very few. It might look good in practice in terms of like percentage to have paralyze and actually a percent to inflict petrify, which is the first time we've seen this mechanic. This is for me really either A, for manual PvP or for very odd PvE content where you have an opportunity to petrify an enemy. But you're not going to be using this most opportunities in game. And then Dark Gut is like very confusing to me that they even put this on here. If you were to really like look and compare, it's a range height of 2, AoE ahead of 1, it's 185% modifier. That's exactly the same. And even the range, that's exactly the same as Dystopia, except Dystopia is actually 2 AP less to cast, is 28 versus the 30. It's a double hit, also has stop, this has nothing, and the cast time of Dystopia is 320 compared to the cast time of 200, meaning Dark Gut takes longer to cast. I have literally no idea why this is on here. I can't imagine why she'd ever use it, so do not use this sub-jump by and large. Comes down to what you want to use for the rest. Now, Scholar is probably my preference at the moment, but Devout, as we'll get to in a second, has some massive upside as well. So there's a couple things that I like about Scholar. Number one, it does give her access to some additional kinds of buffs, but more than anything, the access to Law of Geo Absorption is a very important one. This obviously is a great ability where it's a very large and forgiving AoE for how enemies are spaced. You absorb 30% of the damage, it's still 185% modifier, but there's two big key characteristics here. Number one, it's strike type damage, which enemies don't always build up resistances to, and Celeste in particular is weak to, same with Astria, so it does really work well in that matchup. But number two, if you're looking at the icons here on the left, it is non-reflectable, which means it cannot be absorbed by Runic Shield. So in the instance that you aren't able to dispel it for whatever reason, she's outside the range or who knows what, this will still bypass it and do damage, which I absolutely love. So this is a great ability for that reason. One of the reasons why I love the Scholar job. I do like the buffs on here. Law of Preservation is a good one depending upon the meta you're in, where increasing defense of 15 while also being able to nullify all defense break is certainly powerful, particularly for some of those mirror matchups of Dark versus Dark, where there's a lot of Dark imperils, and same could be said for Water going against Astrid, so the defense breaks there. So I like that ability a lot. Law of Speed Reading is another good one, particularly because it's almost similar to what her TMR is, where the decreased activation time of 350 is very similar, but I like the Restore CT portion of this too, where you're able to at least get your next turn faster. You're not always going to be able to cast these two, but there's a time and place where you can. We'll get to that soon. Which brings us to the last job, the Devout Sub job. This is actually a really great one. So Teachings of the Dark is one of the most powerful abilities in the game by enabling an ally. So Dark Attack 30, debuff resistance of 30, while still decreasing her cast time by 300. So this does very similar things as to her TMR and the ability we just saw on the Scholar sub job. Cure and Cura, not a big fan of. It's really Law of Invigoration here, which is the bottom ability. That's the main bread and butter of the healing, where obviously the 210 healing is going to be very impactful considering her magic stat, but also the ability to increase the agility and attack of Leeler or Joker has massive ramifications on the battle. I do like Law of Mitigation as well. I just don't love it. She already gets the AoE resistance from her main job buff, which always doesn't always apply. You've seen it. If you fall below 70, it ends up going away. And while slash resistance is nice, it's only for herself, and she's got enough survivability as it is that I don't think it really changes a lot. But Devout is really great in particular when you talk about second attacks on Guild Wars or second defense, where if your team is low health, she will, and we'll see this in a second, actually opt to heal them before she does anything with Law of Invigoration. So the ability to at least have that little bit of healing is still some great upside when you consider that you're subbing her in for Lemure in that dark meta, if you will, cast of 3. Now for the limit break, this is a genuinely good one. I think it's bugged at the moment though, just a little bit. If you notice in game, it doesn't really stack damage the way properly, or at least doesn't display it. So I think this might be something mechanically odd, but we'll see if that ends up getting fixed. But 200% modifier, it's a quad hit ability, dispels all buffs and dispels haste. Now I love this one, not only for the utility of the buffs and the haste dispel, but the quad hit. One of the great things about Dark Fina is that this ability, and the same with Dystopia and that they're double hits, allows for when Joker and Dark Leela attack to really have some high impact damage on that element chain. We saw how potent that was when it comes to synergies like Elena and Jaden, where you have someone set up the chain and then someone finish it. This is that same kind of concept, so this is where they work together really, really well. Now we look at her mastery ability, increase HP of 10% and the dark attack of 15, but I really like the fact that she has perma magic attack resistance penetration of 20, allows for some flexibility with the chest stones and the weapon and what you might equip, but it also increases the magic with 10%, and that's really what kind of keeps her perma at the top of the list for high magic stat, because if you actually recall, she doesn't have any passives that boosts her magic, where most characters, or really all characters, do have something that can at least increase their primary stat. She doesn't. She really does it via the mastery ability here. So while it might look like nothing at first, it's actually a nice trade-off considering she can't get it via her passives. This is basically subbing in for that. Now, the AI and auto prioritization. Number one, she has a DPS AI, meaning she will always prioritize attacking an enemy in range instead of buffing. I don't want to hear anybody complaining about the Devout Subjob that she's not healing her teammates nearby when there's an enemy in range. That's not how it's supposed to work. You're fitting a square peg into a circle hole. Don't even think about it that way. But the nice thing too is that the order of these abilities still applies whether or not there's a teammate nearby or not. That's not always the case. Some of the teammate buffs get prioritized whether or not there is a teammate nearby you or not. All of her abilities, from what I can tell, are exactly the same order. So, if you have the Scholar of Hess Subjob, which you shouldn't, but if you do, what her preference is Enfer Wall, which is the big buff of the magic, the spear penetration, yada yada, dark, light resist. That's always number one. Number two is Curse of the Serpent, which is her re-raise ability. And then number three is Mystic Revoke, which is the magic buff and status ailment resistance. And then finally, I have the TMR. This is her TMR. So not every TMR. There's some that have different prioritization. I obviously can't test for all of them, but I want to at least look at her TMR. Surprisingly, is the fourth of the priorities here. You don't always see that. A lot of times characters' own TMRs are bumped up a little higher. That's not the case here. So when we consider the Scholar Subjob, you add some buffs into the mix here. So she still prefers Enfer Wall and Curse of the Serpent 1 and 2. That's the case in almost all these situations. But Law of Preservation is the third. That's the one that increases defense and the defense debuff resistance. I like this one a lot that it's third. You won't always have the opportunity to get a third buff off, but in the case that you do, out of the remaining ones here, I do think this is a good one, unless you have a top tier TMR ability that takes the place of one of these three. Mystic Revoke is next, and the TMR, and then the Law of Speed Reading is last. That's the one that decreases activation time and increases her CT by 300. So while I was talking about the ability, I'm a little intrigued that the TMR is this low because they kind of do really similar things here in terms of the cast time reductions. But that finally brings us to the Devout Subjob. Now, Devout Healing, which is the heal ability, she will never use unless a teammate is low health. But if you start off a battle and a teammate is, she will prefer Devout Healing above all of these, even Enfer Wall, which is really impactful. That's not always the case. Renan, in particular, is a character that he actually has a prioritization of his own personal buff before he does any Devout Healing, which is kind of odd. She doesn't have that here, so that's number one. But you still get this same listing of buffs that the Hess Subjob does and the Scholar Subjob does, except Teachings of the Dark, which is the debuff resistance, the unit resistance is the last. But if you consider certain kinds of toggles, in my opinion, I'm usually disabling Mystic Revoke. I don't know if it's all that impactful, again, unless it's a specific chess matchup. And her TMR, although I actually really like it, we'll get to in a second, probably not as impactful as the support of Teachings of the Dark, where this is such a good ability. It's probably going to have way more teamfight impact than her own TMR. But it's good to know this and lock this down. So now we get to the TMR analysis. This is an accessory. I love the stats in this for an accessory. It's got 288 HP, 6 spirit, 7 agility is really important. 8 accuracy is certainly nice just to throw it in there. The TMR ability, I like that it has 2 casts, and it does 2 things. Number one, it increases the magic attack resistance penetration of 40 for 3 turns, and it decreases the cast time of 350 for all kinds of abilities. Now, the cast time reduction we've seen is a little bit redundant in her kit where she's got some other buffs that can do that, so you're getting some overlap. But the magic attack resistance penetration of 40 is really good for certain matchups against really high magic tanks. I will do much more on this in part 3 when we do the cast time reduction to really quantify what that 350 means. But overall, I do still like this accessory from the perspective of the stats as well as the magic attack resistance penetration. Even if not on her, there's certainly a lot of magic units that really would prefer that. I know Garvel's TMR does something a little bit similar, but I think this is probably better than his just for the extra abilities and the stats on it. Which brings us finally to our general thoughts on the character. Now, very hard-hitting magic unit, as I've kind of hyped up. Great magic stat, lots of magic and spirit penetration. The unit resistance down of 30 is a great imperil for her follow-up damage as well as the teammates. She does have this stop effect, which is very potent. I kind of glossed over that in the ability section, but I cannot underrate how devastating it would be if you can put stop on your enemies. That's one of the few status resistances which doesn't get interrupted, like sleep or confusion. If you get hit by something, if you're stopped, you're perma-stopped until it wears off. So that's very impactful when you talk about killing things quickly and not taking a lot of damage, which they don't have a dedicated healer, they don't have a dedicated tank, so being able to limit the enemy turns is a big influential part of what makes them work. I will say there probably is some difficulty balancing the buff order. There is many to choose from. You have to make sure that with Enfer Wall, you can not repeat it if you're trying to get a lot of buffs off. You need to, position your teammates to both get into it at once. That being said, that's kind of the nice thing about her agility being lower, is that you can typically have the teammates move to her first, and then she can use Enfer Wall. That's not always the case if you have a really fast character. They'll usually end up just running in circles to buff everyone that walks by them. So that's kind of to Fina's benefit. She's a little bit slower than them. She does have interesting attack options, since Comet is non-elemental, where one of the biggest things that I learned when Lucio came out, when I'm looking at his character, I'm like, this guy can get up to like 80% light resistance easy. That's so awesome. And I would try running him against a character like Black Rosalena. And what would end up happening is Black Rosalena, similar to Dark Fina, has an elemental-less magic attack, which means dark resistance doesn't mean anything because it's not a dark attack. It's an elementalist attack. So even if you are really gearing hard for dark resistance, like if you're going as a light unit or who knows what, Comet will bypass that, which is really impactful for damage overall. So although you might look at that and be like, wow, that ability is weaker because you don't get all the dark modifiers, at the same time, it bypasses all the dark resistance. So you kind of pick and choose your poison here, but I think it's really good in the broad scheme of things. Now, she is limited for AoE potential, but as mentioned, that is balanced by Leela and Joker. She does still have that Geo Absorption and the Cross Shape attack, so it's not like she has nothing. It's just not what she's known for in terms of highest damage output, but I don't think it's going to be a problem overall. And little sneak peek to part 3, when you equip the Black Rosalena Vision card on her, whether the main or the sub, she does get that AoE resistance down ability that's on the Vision card. So theoretically, you have access to another kind of AoE damage as well. As I've harped on 10,000 times, works exceptionally well with Joker and Leela. Really enables their damage with the unit resistance down in the chaining. Very tanky mage, as we saw in part 1. So in terms of survivability there, from her defense and spirit values, the buff that gives her more, the resistance of light and dark that she can give herself and teammates, the re-raise, the AoE resistance, the law of preservation on the Scholar Subjob, lots of great things here for her survivability, even if her health pool isn't the highest thing in the world. And finally, good Devout utility with the buff. Can't understate how impactful 30 debuff resistance is, the 30 element attack for your teammate, the cast time down for her. It's a really great buff overall. If you can somehow interweave it into your turn rotation, very, very impactful. But that's the Dark Fina Part 2 review in a nutshell of the class and job abilities. Very excited to go over Part 3 as we continue to mock with this character more. We have an interesting map to use, probably not the best map for her, but it's certainly not a bad one. So I'm looking to hopefully get some intriguing results, and obviously we'll know a ton more next week in the arena as well when the map resets on Monday. We're going to get Dark Fina as the bonus unit for that week, and then on Wednesday she gets her vision card as well. So it's really not until next Monday or Wednesday when we get her vision card too that we can really kind of see how to stress test how well she does. So part 3 probably going to be a little bit longer than what it took to do part 2, but it is coming, I promise. I want to make sure that review is everything you need to possibly know to make her shine. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll talk to you all soon.